Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt, and this week we are introducing a new segment called Global Intel, where we are going to focus on flashpoints across the world in recent weeks and months.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And to start the Global Intel, we're going to focus on the first country in this segment being the situation in Sudan. On Wednesday, the Sudanese armed forces announced the complete liberation of the capital city, Khartoum, from the rapid support forces. There has been multiple drone videos and videos on the streets from civilians and OSINT reporting, confirming that the rapid support forces have pulled out of Khartoum. This pullout on Wednesday follows in this week the announcement of the Sudanese armed forces seizing not only the presidential palace, but also the international airport in Khartoum, signifying a kind of a significant deterioration of the rapid support forces kind of hold in a lot of areas in Sudan, not just the capital. I mean, Matthew, we've seen a significant change in the tide of war in the Sudanese civil war, where the Sudanese armed forces, a couple of years ago when this war started, it was pretty clear that the rapid support forces were the ones gaining a lot of territory, advancing in large areas. But something changed recently, and now we're starting to see the Sudanese armed forces seizing more and more territory from the rapid support forces. And now the basic liberation of Khartoum from the rapid support forces, it's a significant blow for the RSF. Wouldn't you agree?
100%. And so we're definitely seeing RSF on the back foot. I think, it's going to become even more complicated for the discussions that have been happening around a potential ceasefire. Everything seems far too fractured to continue that discussion at the moment. Although I think if you're in the shoes of the Sudan armed forces, then you're maybe going to want to push as much as you can until you then re-engage in those discussions.
I think that's the question. The leader of the rapid support forces, who kind of initiated the failed coup that transitioned into the Syrian civil war, Hamedi. I mean, I think one of the issues he's running into is he's finding multiple conflicts at once within the civil war, and his forces are kind of divided. We have the situation, his RSF, launching offensives in Darfur, committing gross human rights violations, and kind of a repeat, almost a concern of a repeat of a kind of the Darfur genocide. But I think one of the things I would be interested in seeing, we haven't really seen that much press reporting lately, is we haven't seen a surge of support to the RSF either from Russia, which historically had relations with Wagner. It's interesting to note that President Putin is trying to get the port of Sudan, which is under the Sudanese armed forces control, the rivals of the RSF. So I'm wondering if Russia kind of switched sides and tried to get now with more the Sudanese armed forces rather than the RSF, and that was a degradation. And we really haven't seen a major support or push either from Chad, but more importantly from the UAE to increase support of the RSF. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I would. And I mean, Russia obviously has other things that they are focusing on. And backing the losing side of this is, and we don't know that they're the losing side, but I don't think they're in a position to come in, at least not immediately at this point, to sort of save the RSF, if that makes sense.
I would
And
agree with that, and honestly, I think the writing is on the wall right now. But again, we've seen in this multi-year civil war how the tides can change. It looked like the SAF for the longest time was on the back end, and the RSF was bound to win. And now we're in a different situation. The question now is, does Hamedi able to reorganize his forces and kind of turn the situation? But the loss of Khartoum and the kind of the control that the RSF had in certain areas, and I think it's important to our listeners to understand that the capital was divided. It wasn't one side or the other controlled the capital completely. It was divided in different neighborhoods, but key strategic areas of Khartoum did fall within the RSF, specifically the airport. Right now, with the loss of that airport, I mean, now the Sudanese armed forces have a additional logistical hub that they can probably leverage and utilize for any groups and countries that might support them, and that would enable more aid, more military support, and enabling the SAF to continue their offensive. So I would say that right now, and then the remainder, at least in the next couple of weeks to months, the SAF is going to be on the winning side. But the civil war is not in any way, shape, or form. Should our listeners think that the civil war is going to end anytime soon?
No, I would also agree with that. And at the end of the day, like it's not like the RSF has made friends with the civilian population. So I don't see any sort of uprising of support coming from the areas that they were occupying. But on that point, I think, we can transition to their neighbor just to the south in South Sudan, where we recently saw artillery fire near Juba. And so it seems like the civil war in South Sudan might be coming back to the forefront.
Yeah, and so again on Wednesday, I mean, I think Wednesday was a pretty big news day internationally in crises, and specifically in the African continent. But on Wednesday, we saw breaking news reports of the South Sudan's main opposition leader, Riek Machar, who's the leader of the South People's Liberation Movement in opposition. So he was the lead opposition figure. He was arrested and detained. And this kind of, though, I think the writing was on the wall. If you track South Sudan, the United Nations has actually been warning for weeks that the political tensions inside South Sudan was increasing between the president and the opposition, right? And for our listeners, the South Sudanese civil war was a very brutal civil war, happened shortly after South Sudan gained its independence. I believe it was in 2013 when the civil war started. Shortly after the country gained independence, the country had months in the international stage when the civil war started. And it was because of these two leaders, the president and the opposition leader. And what managed to end the civil war was there was this peace agreement where again the president and the opposition leader would become the vice president, but there was never this unitary attempt to unify South Sudan as a single political entity, and still both sides still had control of their own kind of armed groups, militias, etc. And South Sudan still had a lot of internal ethnic tensions, but the main concern, because that has always existed, specifically with the Nur tribe and others, but the main concern in the context of South Sudan was, do we see this civil war reigniting because of tensions between the president and the vice president? Well, the vice president was detained on Wednesday, and the opposition party, as mentioned, the Sudan's People Liberation Movement of Opposition, basically announced the peace treaty is dead. And as you mentioned, Matt, we see now that there's artillery fire in Juba. The question is, can the international community, the United Nations, stop this from escalating? And the country that we would have to look at the African Union. We would have to look at kind of the neighboring countries as well. But at least in the global stage, the one country that I would probably try to see and look at to maybe try to mitigate this, maybe, and this is kind of a stretch, so it would be China. But we haven't really seen anything done at the Chinese list side. China has a significant peacekeeping force in South Sudan as part of a United Nations peacekeeping mission. But it looks like nobody's trying to prevent this, and the writing is on the wall that the civil war is going to start. And it's important to highlight almost 400,000 people died as a result of that civil war.
And so I don't know if that was a Freudian slip, but I thought I heard you say the neighboring country we can look to is China, and obviously they have a lot of ties to Africa. But I also think there should be concerns and there should be attention paid to what's happening in Sudan. Obviously, the cross-border dynamics there, since the split are interesting. The little bit more stable, but I mean there are implications that there might be some flow of arms, and militias might have cross-border ties. But the other thing is, if the conflict in Sudan increases in its intensity, we could see movement of refugees and inflows into South Sudan. And I imagine that's not going to make anything easier. And the last thing I would just point to is you were talking about the SPLM, and the fact that we have this rivalry between Kiir and Machar, that doesn't make for stable politics. And I do think, because things were going better than expected, that maybe this fell off the radar a bit for a lot of people, myself included.
No, and what I was mentioning is that the neighboring countries, when I meant China, just to make sure, is as a global power, right? If you're looking at the United Nations Security Council, the permanent members, the one that probably might have more interest and maintaining the stability is China because of the peacekeeping forces. And for those who don't know, during the Civil War, which was between around 2013 to 2018, the Chinese military did deploy forces specifically into the capital of Juba as a peacekeeping force. And there's a lot for those who are interested to kind of want to understand the Chinese militaries and their tactics, their procedures, and how they would fight. I mean, there was glaring failures in the Chinese peacekeeping force during the Civil War in trying to maintain protections in Juba, specifically to the civilian population. The Chinese People's Liberation did pretty bad and kind of showed a lot of holes and deficiencies within the structure of the PLA and even something as simple as kind of a peacekeeping mission compared to, let's say, an expeditionary offensive operation in midst of it, let's say, Taiwan. But kind of going back, some of the countries that I would look at from the neighboring side is, we do know that Uganda has in the past deployed forces to support South Sudan against certain rebel groups. Uganda did deploy forces into South Sudan. Um, but I think of the problem that South Sudan is running into is even from a regional perspective, is that a lot of these countries that might be able to try to intervene to maintain the peace and stability have their own crises. I mean, what we're seeing in Africa as a whole is a huge degradation of the security environment. Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, and then the next country we're going to talk about in this global intel will be Somalia. That I just don't see that any country or regional group or even the international body has the will or the desire to try to intervene in this conflict. That there's a whole myriad of issues, but ultimately boils down to this idea of political power between the two main political leaders of Sudan, the president and the vice president. So it would be interesting to see if the violence continues to escalate, or is there some sort of diplomatic breakthrough that averts a repeat of a very violent civil war.
And with so many conflicts or flashpoints going on across the world at this point, I think it's very difficult to track all of them, but it's also very difficult for some of these international powers to uh, decide where they're going to spend the bandwidth. And just read China, I'm picking up what you were putting down, but you also said ineffective peacekeeping forces. And speaking of which, the next topic, Somalia.
Yeah, no, Somalia. And I mean, it's just kind of this arc of instability that we're seeing, and Somalia is just another case in point on what we're seeing in the United States specifically, and if we're analyzing this from an American perspective, right? For our listeners who don't know, in the military structure, there's a what we would call combatant commands, and they divide up the world in different military commands. And the one kind of responsible for the African continent is called AFRICOM, United States African Command. And what we're seeing, and from a U.S. perspective, is that U.S. AFRICOM has really pulled a lot of its assets outside of Africa. They've always been kind of this lesser priority. But what we're really seeing the United States, the exception to that in the African continent is in Somalia. United States AFRICOM, specifically since President Trump came into office, has increased significantly the amount of airstrikes they've done against ISIS Somalia and then Al Shabaab. And the Somali civil war has been going on for decades. Everybody is very probably intimately familiar with the famous movie Black Hawk Down. But in this current movement, in this current structure, what we're seeing is the Somali government, who is very fractured, not only politically, but as a country as a whole. There's always these separatist movements, both in Somaliland, who's trying to get international recognition, has been unable to achieve that. There has even been kind of tensions within Puntland. And kind of the Somali federal government has been trying to manage all these different regional and tribal groups and political players and basically failing to kind of create this unitary country, but at the same time fight a decades-long war, multi-decade at this point, against the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda affiliate. And now you have the introduction of ISIS Somalia. And what we're seeing is the United States, at least from a counterterrorism perspective, really taking its game up and increasing airstrikes. And one of the interesting aspects, if you read U.S. AFRICOM's press releases, is specifically that they always mention that this is in kind of coordination and with the approval of the Somali government, right? The federal Somali government. And that's clear. I mean, I think Somalia, without U.S. AFRICOM, without the support, not only of airstrikes, but of U.S. military personnel deployed into Somalia to provide support, not only to the Somali federal government, but even the peacekeeping forces there under an African Union mandate. Um, without AFRICOM, those both entities would have a very, very hard time of stopping Al Shabaab's offensives. And the concern that a lot of us are seeing from kind of more of a global aspect is Somalia. I think is a case in point of where international terrorist organizations such as Al Qaeda and ISIS have really shifted their base of operations from the Middle East in a lot of ways to Africa. And we've had a lot of episodes kind of talking about the Sahel. But one area that I would focus heavily on is Somalia, right? ISIS is really trying to establish its kind of new power structure in Somalia with ISIS Somalia. A lot of the leadership of the global ISIS caliphate is based out of Somalia. Al Shabaab is advancing and managing to challenge the African Union mission there and challenge even their bordering countries like Kenya. And with the violence that we're seeing in East Africa, specifically as a previous episode we had with Woofers talking about Ethiopia, the problem is there's not that many resources. And really, AFRICOM is probably one of the last kind of hopes that the Somali government has to ensure that these counterterrorism operations continue. But Matthew, I mean, I would say that Al Shabaab is very much resurgent, and you always had this underlying of ISIS Somalia also very present. Mostly, I believe in more in the northern areas. That ISIS, Somalia, and Al Shabaab don't necessarily operate in the same areas. So this is an area that I think in the Trump administration there's going to be a lot of focus on, and we're not seeing any indications that U.S. AFRICOM is going to stop doing strikes there.
Yeah, and I mean, so I do have a question for you on AFRICOM and their recent involvement. But in talking about, or maybe not recent involvement, but potentially escalating involvement in terms of the SNA, so the Somali National Army, it does seem that they are increasing or intensifying their operations, and obviously they wouldn't be able to do that without the United States. But the United States is also very aware of uh, how violent Al-Shabaab can be. And we had that incident at Camp Simba where we had contractors and a lot of equipment, including aircrafts, destroyed. So we had the contractors killed and the aircrafts destroyed. And that was in Kenya. That wasn't in Somalia. And the United States is sort of limited in their footprint there. They have Bale Doggle and probably not pronouncing that right. Obviously, Camp Lemonade is up there and probably Mogadishu. But other than that, but the US can obviously project that power. But my question to you, in terms of projecting that power, is what is allowing AFRICOM to intensify operations in Somalia right now? What are they taking advantage of?
I think it's the U.S. military base, so specifically CJTF, Combined Joint Task Force, Horn of Africa, out of Djibouti. That's probably the main center of operations for a lot of these counter ISIS and Al Shabaab operations in Somalia. I think it would even be an interesting tidbit that I think the closure of a lot of the military force, U.S. military presence from AFRICOM in West Africa, like let's say Niger, I think kind of enabled U.S. AFRICOM to reposition a lot of forces to East Africa, specifically our military base in Djibouti. And I think that kind of enabled it. But the United States is a global power and the only country in the world that's able to quickly and rapidly deploy forces anywhere around the world in an expeditionary manner. And I think AFRICOM, there was press reporting a couple weeks ago of one of the considerations that the Secretary of Defense Hegseth was considering for kind of for cost saving measures was closing and ceasing U.S. AFRICOM and then putting it back under U.S. European Command. And where more than likely the structure that would work is you would have U.S. European Command and be responsible for the African continent, and then you would probably have a four-star general underneath or part of U.S. European Command, but responsible for AFRICOM. I think this might be a way for U.S. AFRICOM and their operations in Somalia to say no. We're still very important, and I think there's also this risk and this concern of a resurgence of Al Qaeda and ISIS in Africa because clearly that's where a lot of the focus is, and I think the United States has a very well established presence in the Horn of Africa. We also have a very well established presence just across the pond, across the Red Sea in the Gulf. And I think a lot of those capabilities do enable the United States to kind of focus on the Horn of Africa, because I think a lot of the people, when they hear Somalia, they think of the Somali pirate crisis, which has obviously subdued substantially. But there's still a lot of maritime missions, either the European Union or even, kind of under CENTCOM, Combined Task Force 150, and others that still kind of maintain those mission stats for freedom of navigation against piracy. But that kind of enables this focus on Somalia. But I think that last tidbit there of kind of the Horn of Africa and freedom of navigation is a perfect opportunity, Matthew, to kind of jump into our next crisis around the world, which is, across the Red Sea from Somalia, Yemen.
Yeah, so let's take that 200-mile jump across the Gulf of Aden over to Yemen.
Yeah, and so in Yemen, I mean, we're seeing the key aspect of this is, um, I would even say it's not a continuation, because we did see the United States under the Biden administration conduct airstrikes against the Houthis to try to degrade their capabilities of stopping, freedom of navigation, targeting maritime vessels and merchant vessels. Clearly, the latest rounds of airstrikes that the Trump administration has been executed have been a lot more intense, right? We've seen targeted assassinations against Houthi figures, specific within the Houthi missile command system. We're seeing, this week, we saw the United States even reportedly conduct strikes directly at Houthi military barracks, right? And so, the Biden administration was kind of focused their airstrikes on the capabilities that the Houthis have to degrade and to attack merchant vessels and U.S. naval vessels in the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden. And the Biden administration, I mean, President Biden famously said, our airstrikes going to stop the Houthis from attacking merchant vessels? No. Are we going to stop our attacks? No. I think there was a very clear messaging from the United States that this was kind of a retaliation against the Houthis. And I think the Biden administration was hoping that maybe a permanent ceasefire in Gaza would enable freedom of navigation to continue. Um, I think the Trump administration is taking a very different approach. They're vastly expanding the strikes, and I think what they're trying to do is, not only degrade the Houthi capabilities of conducting ballistic missile strikes at merchant vessels or even at Israel, but they really want to cause pain into the structure of the Houthi military force. And so we've seen this expansion of military strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. But it's very important to highlight that the Houthis continue to launch ballistic missile, drones, and cruise missile strikes, not only against U.S. warships in the Gulf of Aden, but still to Israel. And I think the Houthis is a very interesting case study where a non-state actor group that would have fallen within the traditional aspect of an insurgent foreign terrorist organization has really expanded their capabilities since its inception to now to the you know capabilities that are pretty much reserved for nation states, and not that many countries have the capabilities that the Houthi have in terms of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and one-way attack UAVs. And so the question then would become, at what point does the Trump administration view success has been achieved? Because if their goal is to militarily degrade the Houthis, and I don't think they're trying to, overthrow the Houthis from power, but at least degrade them so they're no longer a threat to freedom of navigation or maybe even to Israel. Uh, this is going to be a very long campaign, and we are seeing the strikes that the United States has conducted in Yemen is to inflict that pain.
The Houthis, an ethnic group towards sort of the northwest in Yemen, um, came to be in the 90s as kind of a pushback of some of the religious pressure that was being put on Yemen by the Saudis. There's obviously a long and complicated history there. We have seen successful operations in Yemen against Al Qaeda, but we also saw in 2015 the KSA, Saudi Arabia, getting pulled into offensive action against the Houthis, and they ended up having to back down. So when we're talking about the United States here, it seems like there's maybe non-strategic ambiguity in terms of some of the comments coming out. With Hegseth saying he doesn't care about the how the Yemenis civil war um, ends. That's not exactly what I think we want to hear, but it seems like, some people within the admin are pushing for sort of this full scale until the Houthis are overthrown. Um, but at the same time, the end goal really seems to be for the majority of the administration, or the line that's being put out is just stop shooting at American ships.
And one of the things that, we had one of our earlier episodes in the Start of the Bluff podcast specifically talked about Yemen and the Houthis. And, one of the interesting aspects I need to have this conversation, right, is when we're analyzing the Houthis, the key question, obviously, and the key backer of the Houthis is Iran, right? But at some point, the question has to be, how much of the Houthi power base is because of Iran and the sense of their ability to launch these ballistic missiles, these cruise missiles, these drones? In other words, do they require these shipments from Iran, well documented, well established arms shipment that the Iranians have done to the Houthis in Yemen? Um, is that what is enabling the Houthis to be successful, or do the Iranians basically do this? Teach, train the trainer, where Iran gave them the capabilities to the Houthis so that the Houthis can produce their own system. And a lot of that's kind of the question. But I'm leaning towards the Iranians have given the capabilities of the Houthis to be domestically resilient, because when you see U.S. Fed press statements about these strikes, but all the way from the Biden administration even to now, we continuously hear terms as ballistic missile production facilities, weapon manufacturing, etc. And so I think the Iranians were critical in allowing the Houthis develop their own capabilities, so that if for whatever reason, let's say that shipment corridor is shut, and there's a lot of interdiction operations that happen, and specifically within the Gulf of Aden, and all the way from the Persian Gulf all the way down to the Red Sea, we see all these interdiction operations, and those still continue. But clearly, Iran has enabled the Houthis to have their own domestic weapons manufacturing capability, and pretty robust at that, right? But it's important to highlight that a lot of the missile systems that the Houthis announce and say that they produce, and they kind of pride themselves of their domestic weapons manufacturing, for all intents and purposes, they're almost mirror copies of Iranian ballistic missile programs, right? And I think that's something that is key to highlight. But obviously, the Houthis have their own capabilities, and a very robust system at that, because even after months and months of bombing, the Houthis continue to launch attacks against Israel and U.S. forces and merchant vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden.
Yeah, and I'm willing to bet that maybe uh, even Iran thought that or thinks at this point that they've given the Houthis a bit too much in terms of their domestic capabilities, because keeping in mind they are a people, a organization, a terrorist group that has sort of their own goals. And I'm not sure at this point that, even though Iran is, still willing to support them, I'm not sure Iran has the influence that many seem to believe it does over the Houthis. But
And if I may just put one point, though, I think it is a key component to highlight. I think there's the kind of that political aspect you were mentioning about the political at the strategic level between, let's say, the Ayatollah and the Iranian, president, et cetera, and the leadership there and the Houthi leadership. But it's very important to highlight that still to this day, it is well known the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has a well-established presence in Yemen, and they're key enablers for the Houthi capabilities to conduct strikes against Israel. And that, I'm going to use that as an opportunity to pivot to the next area we want to focus on, which is
well,
why the Houthis did a lot of these strikes in against Israel, is the situation and the development in Gaza. Um, the ceasefire, I believe, Matthew, I'm going to let you opportunity to answer to this. So this is my question to you. Would you agree that the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is effectively over?
yeah, so to be honest, I think that's fair to say at this point. We're still seeing attacks by Hamas. We're seeing the IDF escalating their counteroffensive. And I think one of the things really to focus in on least from my perspective, to say that this is collapsing, if not completely collapsed, is that one of the things that's going to be very important is the humanitarian aid flow into Gaza, and that's part of like the second and third portions of what was the ceasefire agreement. But now Israel is continuing to blockade and restrict aid delivery into Gaza. And, we're still seeing very severe food shortages and shelter shortages, medicine's not getting in. And that is all going to be something that needs to be addressed before we can look at rebuilding the infrastructure in Gaza, which is a key part of, the ceasefire and moving forward to something more permanent. And if the infrastructure is still being destroyed, well, it's going to be very difficult to start rebuilding.
I mean, we're starting to see Israel and the Israeli Defense Force. If we use the ceasefire agreement, this latest one, right, in January 19th, as kind of a turning, a mark between this larger war, right? Prior to January 19th, kind of the Israeli Defense Force's policy and plans related to Gaza was, from a military term, in a lot of ways, was a lot of raids. Yes, there was aspects of the Israeli Defense Forces would seize terrain and hold it, but not at a large scale, right? They would go in, clear area, pull out. Hamas would come in. The Israelis would kind of rinse and repeat. The reporting that we're getting, it does look like now Israel's plan is to go in and to solidify control. But the key aspect, I think, the difference is the reason why is why Israel now feels more comfortable of trying to seize and hold territory in Gaza, unlike before. Israel is not necessarily concerned anymore with the northern border, right? During the Gaza war, after October 7th, 2023, I think Israel viewed Hezbollah as their greatest military threat and the ability to really harm Israel's position,
I,
and specifically in the communities in northern Israel.
I think a lot of us did,
Yep.
and maybe that was a overestimation.
What I don't know if I don't think it was an overestimation, and I think because I think the Israelis really did a really good job of applying lessons learned in 2006, and Hezbollah I think didn't adapt, but Israel did. And I mean, if you see Israel's adaptation and the Israeli Defense Force military doctrine, a lot of their modernization and weapon procurement was a direct response to the lessons learned of 2006. Yeah, Hezbollah just did a rinse and repeat, just larger quantities, develop more rockets, develop more ballistic missiles, could do the same with the Rod 1 unit, but it was still the same mode of operandi that the Hezbollah had compared to 2006, and Israel completely transformed and transitioned how they operated, right? And I think Israel then also leveraged Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian civil war to really penetrate within Hezbollah's leadership and really degrade a lot of those capabilities, right? And again, it's important to highlight Hezbollah in no way, shape, or form is defeated as a military organization, but the threat that they have against Israel has been severely, severely degraded, which now, going back to Gaza, and looking at the situation, I think now the Israeli Defense Force is going to adapt a policy, and that's what the reporting we're getting. And look, negotiations are still happening, but Israel does have plans now that they're comfortable enough that they're able to go in, hold, and seize territory in Gaza, right? And really try to ensure that Hamas does not return as the government body, because right now they still are, right? That they are still the main military power in Gaza. What's interesting though, and when Israel resumed airstrikes against Hamas in Gaza, a lot of the people that were targeted and assassinated and killed by these Israeli airstrikes were Hamas leadership, but more specifically, kind of in the governing structure of Hamas in Gaza. You saw a lot of targeted strikes against, and again, it's the Hamas as a whole, both the political, the terrorist arm, the governing arm, whatever you want to call it, it's all one group, right? They're a foreign terrorist organization, all one group. But within the structure of Hamas in Gaza, a lot of the strikes targeted members more associated with internal security, right? The Ministry of Interior, governing bodies, kind of more of the political governing institutions of Gaza. They were assassinated in this strike, right? And a lot of focus was done on them. And I think that is Israel's next. That was a deliberate choice by Israel because they want to severely degrade Hamas's ability to govern. Because even Israeli press have reported that Hamas was able to recruit tens of thousands of militants since the ceasefire and even since the war started to kind of regenerate their combat capabilities. Now it's important to highlight that even though Hamas numbers they might have gained tens of thousands of new fighters, they're nowhere near any way, shape, or form the same level of what Hamas was pre October 7th. These are new recruits that haven't received that much training, and for Hamas, they are just an insurgent that only has the only capabilities they really have left is hit and run tactics. But I think that's Israel's plan is now to do a dislodgement and removal of Hamas that would require a ground force to seize territory. And it's interesting to note that this week we did see the largest protests in Gaza, but these were anti-Hamas um, protests, right? That we've always seen kind of these tidbits of some dissent, some protests, but this week was the most significant protest since October 7th by Gaza civilians directed against Hamas. And I think there's even this idea within Gaza that they're exhausted, that they can't absorb more of this war. And maybe you might see, it's still early to saw, but kind of the beginning of these clans that are very influential within Gaza are they going to try to use political pressure to remove Hamas from power. But even during the height of the Gaza war, Hamas still had a monopoly of violence in many aspects, as internally and an aspect of Gaza and Palestinian militants. Hamas was still the dominant power that was able to clamp down and assassinate, target, and arrest any Palestinian dissent in Gaza. The question now is, with this new round of violence, does Hamas still maintain that capability, or have they lost it? And do we see, who comes next? Is it the Palestinians? Is this technocratic government? Is it the international peacekeeping force come in and replace Hamas? But the protest to me was significant because they were larger than normal.
Well, and it reminds me of one of the earlier conversations we had when talking about Hezbollah, um, but really the Middle East in general, about how it's not the day of, it's the day after, and the day after the day after. And well, Nasrallah, who was the leader of Hamas, was able to claim back in 2006, like, look at how effective we were. He's trying to take this military win. At the end of the day, what he's saying to his leadership is, I was being directly targeted. And it seemed to kind of put a fear in him, but at the same time, like you were saying, they didn't necessarily learn from their mistakes. Well, Israel was able to adapt. And I think this might be a good pivot point here when speaking about Israel and military operations, to pivot to our last topic here, Syria. And specifically, we can start with, I think, the operations that we're seeing from Israel in terms of airstrikes into Syria and their forces sort of taking the place of the UN Blue Helmets, the peacekeepers in Golan.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the concern that the Israeli government has is that they don't trust Giuliani and HTS and this new Syrian government, and Giuliani is kind of trying to establish this post-Assad Syrian government. We are starting to see this idea of, like, if you analyze this from military terms, I mean, from Giuliani's perspective, this is kind of like the stability operations. This year we did see an agreement between the Syrian government and the SDF to try to consolidate and reintegrate the Syrian Kurds into kind of this national government and kind of unifying the military. Obviously, Turkey is concerned about that. They always have had concerns about the Kurds' activities in northeast Syria. Turkey continues to conduct military operations against the SDF. In Syria, as you mentioned, Israel has conducted dozens of strikes against military targets in Syria to try to ensure, at least from their perspective, that the new government is not a threat to Israel. although we have not seen, ever since Giuliani came into power, not a single strike has targeted Israel originating from Syria, right? I think that's important to highlight. And Giuliani, is trying to balance a lot of things because he's also having tensions with Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? There were intense border clashes last week between Hezbollah and then the Syrian government. Three Syrian army soldiers were kidnapped and then executed by Hezbollah. They were kidnapped by Hezbollah, taken over to Lebanon, and then executed. And that saw intense border clashes between Hezbollah and the Syrian army that required the Lebanese army to deploy there to kind of try to maintain the peace. We see Giuliani has interdicted significant amount of still ground weapons smuggling into Lebanon for Hezbollah via Syria. We've seen them interdict a lot of those weapons. And so I think Giuliani is trying to balance everything at once, right? He's trying to have positive relations with the European Union. He's trying to have positive relations, with President Putin in Russia. I mean, there's always this kind of this back and forth: are the Russians going to stay in Syria? Are they going to leave? And that's a lot of that. I think it's really hard to tell exactly what's going on in that diplomatic front from the Syrians and their foreign policy. I think the Russia is an enigma. Sometimes it looks like the Russians are going to pull out, and then sometimes it looks like they're going to stay. And I think there's still a lot of negotiations going on. But the European Union, I do believe, is taking a more forward approach in their dealings with Syria. The United States has taken a very much hands-off approach and still focusing on kind of the OIR mission set and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And that's really just the U.S. focus in Syria. So I think that's going to be the question for Syria, right? And Giuliani is, this tug and pull between Russia, Syria, from a diplomatic side, and then from a military side, this idea of fighting against Hezbollah, trying to ensure they don't go into open conflict with Israel, and then from an internal aspect, which is very important, trying to maintain good relations with the Kurds to see if that agreement that was signed can they be reintegrated. But from an internal security aspect, it's really this fight against Syrian, Assad remnants, right? We did see the Assad remnants, loyalists, do multiple uprisings. The last one was pretty significant, specifically along the Latakia and Tartus provinces, that required a significant deployment of Syrian army personnel to kind of crush it. But every time there's this belief that the Assad remnants and loyals have been crushed, they kind of come back up in another way and another way, and every single uprising we've seen, they've been more and more in higher intensity, not enough really to challenge by any means, way, shape, or form the new Giuliani's government, but they are a concern. And then last but not least, kind of this internal dynamic with the Druze as well, that the Israel has tried to leverage that historical connection between, I believe, between the Israeli Druze and the Syrian Druze. And that's something that Giuliani is trying to balance all at once, and trying to form this new government. But honestly, it looks like nobody is allowing him the opportunity to do it, because anytime he has an agreement, let's say with the Kurds, Turkey gets involved, And so I think that's going to be the problem that he's going to run into. And I think he's going to require this international support. The question then becomes, from a great powers perspective, it looks like it's not going to be the US. So the question is it the European Union, Russia, China? That's the question I think Giuliani has right now.
Yeah, I think I think all of that is very fair. And to be honest, you took a lot of the topics I was thinking of right out of my mouth. And just to clarify for people, Giuliani Giuliani is the nom de guerre for al-Shara, who you might also hear in some of these conversations about the transitional government in Syria. And I think you're right, building off your last point, he has been trying to focus to some extent, to the extent that he can, on this confidence building with some of the minorities, to bring them into the fold. You mentioned Syrian Jewish people. You also mentioned the Kurds, who have agreed to become the SDF has agreed to work with the transitional government, but also the Alawites. And what we saw in Latakia and Tartus at the beginning of the month was pretty atrocious. And my biggest concern that comes from that, or one of the biggest concerns that comes from that, is a renewal of sectarian violence, and also it became clear, if it wasn't already, that uh, the legitimacy of the security forces is maybe a bit in question, because that initial march and overthrowing of Assad didn't actually take a lot in terms of fighting forces, but there are a lot of different and segmented groups within Syria that are all armed and have, their own goals, their own grievances. And I think what we're seeing is, certain vacuums and some smaller and some larger that are opening up. And I don't think that there is a cohesive security force that al-Shara is commanding at this point. And we see Israel coming in from the south. We see Turkey in the north. I worry about conflicts over airspace between the two of those. And Syria doesn't they don't seem to be trending in the right direction. And I truly worry about the reignition of sectarian violence.
I think it's important to highlight is the HTS, which kind of served as the backbone in the Syrian opposition that overthrew Bashar al-Assad, is still a foreign terrorist organization. There is a lot of concern of this kind of HTS Islamist ideology that I think the new Syrian government is trying to tame and trying to transition into try to pivot more maybe to this more. I'm not going to necessarily say Western aligned, but I say of the past, our Islamist past is something that we're not going to utilize currently, and I think there's a lot of skepticism in those claims. But one point I do want to highlight when talking about the United States is, I talked about, ISIS in Syria and how those operations are continuing. But another area we're even seeing as an expansion of U.S. military operations is specifically the Al Qaeda affiliate called Ras al Din. They had a significant presence in Idlib and along northwest Syria. The United States continues to conduct strikes targeting members of Ras al Din, and because those guys were a key external operator planner for Al Qaeda to conduct terrorist attacks against Europe and the United States. If people remember all the way back in 2014 when President Obama initiated airstrikes against Syria, the first targets were not necessarily against ISIS. They were actually directed against Ras al Din because of the threat that they posed to Europe and the United States from an external op point of view. And we are seeing the United States can do strikes against those key operatives in Syria as well. And I think that's another aspect of concern. And how does Syria respond to that? And I think the concern that the new Syrian government has is, are they going to be kind of labeled as the Afghan Taliban, right? Are they going to be compared to the Afghan Taliban? And just as Afghanistan is a harbor for a lot of foreign terrorist organizations, Al Qaeda and ISIS, is there a concern that Syria has become isolated and they are now just harbingers because of either their own political will or because they don't have the capability to fight these foreign terrorist organizations operating in Syria? And I think that's really a lot of the push that this new government is trying to do, and a lot of the negotiations directly with the European Union, is to try to show a commitment to being a reliable partner. And you see that, at least I think, in their attempts to address the concerns of terrorism and foreign terrorist organization, but more importantly, even the Captagon trade, right? I mean, the new government has been very keen at stopping the Captagon, the drug flow from Syria across the Middle East. That Captagon was something that Bashar al-Assad, specifically his brother Hafiz al-Assad, heavily relied on to ensure that money was still flowing into the coffers of the Assad government. I do believe that that's a success story that we're seeing in Syria. The clamping down of the Captagon trade is by no means done, but I think that's something they're going to try to highlight to say, no, look, we're different than the Taliban. Please try to give us the international recognition, and they're going to try to show that image.
And I do think that that is, when you're talking about the drug trade, that is something that has been sort of overlooked in a lot of media, but is something that's very important. There's obviously still sanctions, which are not helping the situation necessarily, but that is what the nascent government is trying to work towards, and just like you said, trying to show this legitimacy. But I also worry about like the new MOD and how many reinforcements they had to call in for this Alawite led violence and ambushes that we saw in along the coastline. And I this is actually something that we are going to have a much more extensive episode on. I look forward to talking about El Hassan and the Coastal Shield Regiment, which was this sort of emerging Alawite movement of pro-Assad forces, the role that Iran is playing, and I think that's going to be a great episode. So I don't want to go too much further. So I think this is probably a good place to wrap up for the week.
Yeah, and Matthew, I really appreciate this. I think this is a first of many segments that we're going to have for our listeners to focus in on this global intel segment, and we're going to make sure that we provide you a good summary on all the flashpoints around the world. But I really appreciate you hosting this, and looking forward to having this episode again.
Yeah, of course. And we will continue with the bluff as usual, but this is the plan is to have this be sort of a more uniform production where we talk about all these different things going on across the world, and there's obviously a lot of topics to cover here. So we'll continue this, and we'll hope to put this out with regularity, and it will have the same date, week after week. So look forward to talking to you. We'll probably bring some guests on in the future, but thank you. This has been Global Intel, which is a segment from the Bluff podcast. I'm Matt,
And I'm Stefano.
and we'll talk to you next week.